What happened under communism in Romania?
Under communism in Romania, the government sought to suppress the faith in every way possible. Christian education was not allowed. And if the government saw somebody who was part of the faith, who was influential in any strong way, they would find any and every way to imprison them and get them out of the public view. There was a movement in the 20th century called the Legionnaires' movement, which began basically as a religious movement but became political. And it ended up in violence, and a lot of the Romanian priests and monks and elders who were a part of it renounced it at that time. But because they had any association with it whatsoever, the communist government would take that association. Even if they had just come to a meeting and given one talk, they would take that as a sign that this was an anti-government and therefore anti-nationalist figure. They were somehow against Romania, and they would use that to imprison them. And the terms of imprisonment could be forced labor for a few months, but often it was for many, many years, to the point that many great figures died in those prison camps. To this day, they're still uncovering mass graves, and the really incredible thing is that in these mass graves, they find bones. Of course, they don't know who the bones belong to, but these bones are often of an amber hue and fragrant, sometimes with myrrh streaming off of them. I've been able to venerate some of these relics, and I will tell you the fragrance coming off of them is unbelievable. And they're finding that many people were sanctified in these prisons. But the government did everything they could to suppress and crush orthodoxy.
I know we talked about this last time before, just very briefly, but could you talk a little bit about the PES Experiment that happened in Romania?
Yeah. There's a book entitled The Anti-Humans. I don't remember the name of the author at the moment, but he talks a lot about this PES Experiment. And the PES Experiment went on for a little bit less than a year. It was discovered what they were doing, and they had to shut down the program. Although many of the methods used there, maybe not to the same extent, were still used in other prisons, especially Aiud was one of the big ones. There are a few other big prisons where they tried these. But in Pitești, they did I think it was about a 10-month experiment. And the goal was to see if they could dehumanize the prisoners through various types of torments. The torments were not just physical, they were also psychological. They would take common church hymns and change the words to make the words mock Christ and the Theotokos and faith, and make them sing them over and over again. They would make them perform mock liturgies where instead of communion they would have human feces. They would play sadistic experiments with people, and if anyone ever tried to commit suicide, they would do everything they could to save their life, and then they would sit them in a chair and they would torture their fellow prisoners even more harshly with them watching in order to keep people from ever trying to commit suicide. The idea was, can we dehumanize people to such an extent that they become quite literally like wild animals? And then, can we build up those wild animals and reorganize them internally to become perfect communists? Instead of creating perfect communists, they created saints. They created many, many saints. This experiment was so horrific that few prisoners would ever talk about what they went through. They were so sadistic that the prisoners couldn't even sleep on their sides. They had to sleep perfectly on their back, and if it looked like they were at peace, it was assumed that they were praying, and the guards would come over and beat them even more severely. It was probably the most horrific, disgusting thing that has ever happened in a prison system in the history of mankind, my guess. I've never come across anything that was this horrific.
Who are some of the holy figures that came out of this prison experiment?
One of the names that I would recommend people look up is Father George Chiu. Father George Chiu, there's a really incredible and wonderful book about him from St. Herman of Alaska Press. It's called Father George Chiu, C-A-L-C-I-U is the last name. Father George Chiu, I think that it's talks, interviews, and homilies, or something like that. I don't remember the exact. But Father George Chiu was one figure who was in those experiments who ended up trying to commit suicide himself. He actually was about to jump over a railing when one of his fellow prisoners grabbed him from behind and held on to him. Father George eventually, when released, he was also exiled from the country. The Reagan administration had heard about him and his imprisonment, and they actually were able to negotiate his release. But he was exiled, so he came to the United States, where he served his last years. He was recently, after he reposed, I think 2006 or 8, I don't remember exactly when. I could be very wrong about that, but I think it was around that time. In Romania, they exhumed his relics, and he's been found to be incorrupt.
I've heard you talk about Elder Cleopa as well. Was he part of that same prison experiment, or was he just under, communist torture?
Yeah, so Elder Cleopa, who, God willing, in 2025 will be officially Saint Cleopa. Elder Cleopa was able to escape direct imprisonment. He would flee into the wilderness, where he had his own torturous existence in the dangerous wilderness with the weather and the wild animals. And that's primarily where he was sanctified. And so when the Securitate, which is the Romanian secret police, when they would seek Elder Cleopa, he would flee into the wilderness. And he did that a couple times and spent quite an extended stay there. He became one of the most important evangelical figures of Romania, so that when communism finally fell, he was recognized out of all the great elders, and there are many great elders in Romania. He was probably recognized as being the greatest. He was an absolute master of the Jesus Prayer. He was utterly clairvoyant. He would spend much of his day sitting outside of his cell. I've been there a couple of times, and there are benches all outside of his cell where the faithful would come and sit, and he would simply preach to them and teach. And he wrote many, many works. Not very many of them are translated, but there are a few. A good place to start is the book, The Truth of Our Faith. And many of his works are really just simple and educational, meant to re-educate the Romanians in the faith that is really their true heritage, that had been squashed out by the Romanian government at the time, the communist government. I think it's probably wrong to call them the Romanian government. They were the communist government at heart. They were not Romanian at all, because Romanians are Orthodox at heart.
Watch the video you put out. I don't remember his name, but it started with a D. Father
Daniel.
Daniel. What's his story? What's his background?
Father Daniel was part of, along with the Legionnaires movement, there was another movement that was purely spiritual, called the Burning Bush movement. And the Burning Bush movement was begun by a man who had the pen name of Sandu Tudor, that later became Father Daniel de la Raru. Father Daniel began his career as an intellectual. He was mainly a philosophical and political student who wrote on topics of culture, politics, philosophy. Eventually, he decided that he wanted to write an expose on the orthodoxy of Mount Athos, because he had heard that a lot of the life of Mount Athos was really not as it's presented to be. It was somewhat fraudulent in some way. And so he decided to go and check it out himself. And he had planned on staying for just a few days and learning a bit about it, coming back and writing this expose. He went there and befriended a monk who said, that's really not enough time to stay longer. And he ended up staying for quite a bit longer. I forget how many weeks or months he stayed, but he ended up integrating what he was learning into his own life. And he found that rather than being a fraud, it was the most legitimate life he'd ever seen. And he came back and became very, very disinterested with politics at that time and the philosophical movements. And so he decided that he wanted to dedicate himself to the practice of the Jesus Prayer. And he began reading the Fathers of the Philokalia, which is this 5-volume anthology of spiritual writings, much of which has to do with the practice of the Jesus Prayer. And he got a small group together, along with a monk from the Soviet Union who had escaped the Soviet Union and come and befriended him, and was a real master of the Jesus Prayer from the writings of these elders. And they had this small group of Romanian, mainly intellectuals, who would gather at, if I remember right, Antim Monastery, and they would have meetings where they would discuss the writings of the Fathers of the Jesus Prayer and practice it. And in doing so, many of them became masters themselves of the Jesus Prayer. This Burning Bush movement, although it was largely informal, was also squashed by the communists, who then went, of course, imprisoned all the people who were a part of it. But the burning bush movement didn't end there. This is the true miracle. It just continued on in the prisons. And because of the burning bush movement, those who had deepened their prayer life were able to take it into the prisons, and thus many of the prisons became like monasteries. And even within the midst of all this torment, true prayer, true faith absolutely spread. And it came to the point where there were not hundreds, but literally thousands of monks, priests, and laymen who were deeply practicing prayer. If I remember the story right, and I did a recent series on various Romanian elders, and so I might be getting some of them mixed up, but when I believe when Father Daniel, he was released, or he may have been one of the ones to repose in the prison system, but either way, the news of his repose immediately spread everywhere. Everybody was aware of it. In some of these monasteries, or in some of these prisons, the prisoners learned Morse code, and they would communicate through the walls through Morse code, and they would let them know whenever one of these great figures had reposed or was released. So they kind of kept up to date with one another with that type of communication. They would also sometimes hear the radios of the communist guards and hear reports about what's happening in the free world in America, and maybe that would kind of fill them with hope. But ultimately, they continued to live like monastics, so that when many of them were released, they then went and formed these monastic communities and just continued the work. And Sandu Tudor, Father Daniel, became one of the great founding members of this burning bush movement, and his legacy absolutely transformed Romania through communism, through the period of communism.
What can people take away from what communism is? Because it seems like nowadays people, they want communism because they think it's going to answer all of their problems. All of society's problems will be answered by communism, supposedly. So what could people take away from what happened in Romania?
Much of what we've discussed today actually could be related to this same question of when we see people who are advocating for communism. I think one of the first things we do, especially as Orthodox Christians, is to look with utter amazement and just to be utterly baffled, knowing what we know about communism and what it produced. How could anybody really aspire to these things? And I think the answer is that when you look at the ideals that communism claims to pursue, we recognize that those are indeed part of the yearning of the heart of man. And we can recognize that and say, okay, there's actually something beautiful that this is aiming for. The problem is that communism does so in an ideological form. And I know I've talked about this before, but I define ideology as when you take a worldview and you make it more important than the person sitting next to you. And this is why communism believes that people are expendable. If they stand in the way of the revolution, they're to be wiped out. And we should just accept that. I think what we really need to recognize about this is that the heart will never find its fulfillment in communism. It'll never find its fulfillment in any ideology. And even if communism were to actually accomplish what it sets out to accomplish, which it does not, we'd have to ask, what then? What then is man really going to live for? If we have a belief, a philosophy, an ideology that does not destroy death, people are going to come up with other motivations for life, and eventually they're going to come into conflict. We will never find the solution to mankind's problems in any ideology, and especially not, we've proven, in communism. It has been absolutely sufficiently proved in the 20th century. So then what we have to do is look at these ideals and say, can we find them in a proper way? And oddly enough, if you're to take some of the ideals of communism, not all of them, but some of the ideals of communism, and input Christ into them, put Christ right at the center, what you find is Orthodox monasticism. You find a monastic system, and you find people who are utterly at peace with utter joy, no matter what happens around them. No matter what persecution comes their way, they're completely at peace. So once we remove Christ, this is really the lesson. You can take even good ideals and they become utterly destructive. They become utterly destructive, not just to society. This is really important. Not just to society, but to the individual hearts of those who adhere to them. And this is where we see people who believe that they're preaching love and yet seem to be the most bitter, angry, broken people you'll ever meet. And they can't seem to make the connection between the fact that what they're preaching and what they have inside of them don't seem to mesh. When they realize that, they seem to want to blame the world around them. But if the only way for you to find peace is for the world around you to live the way that you want, you might as well give up now. Your method of life is futile. It'll never happen.